On Monday morning, my manager didn't even look up when he said it. "We've decided it's time you stepped aside." No warning, no explanation that made sense. Just those words, delivered like a verdict from a judge who had already left the room in his mind. I felt the sting before I fully understood the weight of it, a sharp, surgical kind of pain that told me this wasn't about performance. This was about image, about someone younger, flashier, and easier to put in the company newsletter. When I walked into the conference room that day, my chair was already pushed back from the table. Not by much, just enough to send a message. In a place where every inch of real estate around that polished mahogany meant status, that gap might as well have been a chasm. I stood there for a second, taking in the sight. My name card set at a slight angle, my coffee cup missing, the notepad I always kept there gone without a trace. It was like they had scrubbed away the evidence I had ever been part of this room. The others kept their eyes on the screen as someone clicked through a presentation. Charts, forecasts, words like innovation and transition strategy floating in the air like perfume sprayed to mask a sour smell. No one asked me for input. They didn't even bother with the polite nods anymore. Every topic was suddenly about new directions and fresh thinking, as if my decades of solutions and crisis fixes had become liabilities overnight. I could feel the conversation bending around me, like I was a pillar in the middle of a stream, water rushing past, trying to pretend I wasn't shaping its flow. Inside, something shifted. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was that quieter, heavier break, the kind you feel when you realize the people you've carried on your back have decided you're no longer worth the weight. My mind flicked through the years, the nights I stayed past midnight rewiring systems no one else could understand, the weekends I came in to stop a server from melting down, the time I crawled through a half-flooded basement to fix the backup power after a storm. I'd built so much of the foundation they were standing on now, and here they were, talking like the house could stand without its beams. I kept my face still. I didn't give them the twitch of an eyebrow or the curl of a lip. That would have been too easy for them, a sign they'd gotten to me. Instead, I sat back, hands folded, watching every move, every smug smile, every self-congratulatory nod. Because here's the truth. When you've poured years into something, you don't storm out just because they tell you to. You wait. You watch. You listen for the weak points in the walls they've built without you. And I knew one thing better than anyone in that room. Walls like that always have cracks. You just have to know where to push. Friends, let me take a quick pause. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow the channel. Now, let's continue. It was supposed to be my last day, but it felt more like the longest day of my life. The kind where the clock seems to mock you, its hands barely moving, each second stretching into an ache. I stood at my desk, gathering the pieces of my working life into a dented metal toolbox. My hands knew where everything was without thinking. Precision screwdrivers worn smooth at the handles, a soldering iron with a burn mark that told its own story, a bundle of cables I'd kept just in case, because they'd saved us more than once. Every item I touched carried the weight of nights I'd stayed when the lights were already off, of moments when I'd been the only thing standing between order and collapse. No one offered to help me carry the box. That wasn't surprising. Politeness had become a ritual here, not a feeling. People walked past my desk with the same practiced smiles they used for clients, murmuring things like "best of luck" or "stay in touch," without slowing their pace. I could see it in their eyes. They were already in rooms I would never enter again, chasing projects I'd never touch, shaping plans that didn't have my name on them. It wasn't cruelty, it was worse. It was indifference. I kept packing, listening to the hum of machines I had once personally coaxed back to life. The servers in the next room purred steadily, unaware that the man who had fixed them in the dead of night, through storms and power surges, was being walked out of their orbit. I tightened the lid on my toolbox, the latch clicking shut like a small finality. The metal felt heavier than it should have, though I knew it wasn't the tools. It was everything they represented. Years of skill, patience, late nights, and the kind of quiet victories no one celebrates. When I finally lifted the box, the weight bit into my palm, pulling my shoulder down. I walked slowly through the office, past the glass-walled conference rooms where meetings went on without pause, past the break room where the smell of burned coffee clung to the air. Every step was a rehearsal for absence, mine and theirs. I reached the elevator and waited, staring at the floor numbers blinking lazily, and for the first time all day I let myself think about what I was leaving behind. Not the paycheck, not even the work, but the sense of being essential, of knowing that if something went wrong I could fix it. The doors slid open and I stepped inside, toolbox at my feet. As the elevator descended, the hum of the building faded, replaced by the deeper silence of realization. They wouldn't notice my absence right away. Not until the day something broke that no one else could repair. That day would come. I knew it as surely as I knew the weight in my hands. And when it did, they would remember. A week before my last day, I had already begun to see him everywhere, the man who would take my place. He moved into my chair like he'd been born for it, but I could tell, even from across the room, that he didn't know half of what that position demanded. His hands hovered over the keyboard too long before typing. His eyes darted between screens like he was looking for clues in a language he didn't speak. Still, he had the kind of voice that carried in a meeting, filling the space with confidence untethered to knowledge. He knew how to talk about the future in big, sweeping gestures, the kind that made people forget about the invisible work that kept the present from collapsing. Management loved him instantly. They mistook noise for vision, charm for competence. In the meetings where I once quietly solved problems before they became visible, he pitched ideas wrapped in glossy phrases, promising results he didn't yet understand how to deliver. I watched the nods ripple around the table. No one asked him how. No one pressed for details. The performance was enough. That was all they wanted now, something bright to look at, not something solid to stand on. I began to notice small signs of the shift. My name disappearing from project boards, my notes, left for reference, quietly discarded. Tasks I'd overseen for years now routed to him, even when the questions were ones I could have answered in seconds. The systems diagrams I had drawn, layered with a decade of experience, were gathering dust in a shared folder no one opened. He didn't study them. He didn't have to. He had been given the authority without the burden of understanding. And yet, what struck me wasn't just the ease with which they handed him the keys. It was the coldness with which they took them from me. No gratitude for the times I had been the first in and last out. No recognition for the moments I'd caught failures just before they became disasters. The transition was silent, deliberate, and absolute. I was no longer a part of their plans, only a shadow in the background. Sometimes, walking past my old desk, I would see him leaning back in my chair, one ankle crossed over a knee, laughing with a manager about some breakthrough he'd thought up. A breakthrough that was, in truth, a solution I had already implemented months before. No one remembered, or maybe they chose not to. It was easier to believe they had made the right choice, easier to pretend the old guard was just holding them back. I didn't confront him. I didn't correct him in front of others. There was no point. People don't listen when they've already decided what they want to believe. Instead, I watched quietly, like someone standing in a field before a storm, feeling the air thicken, smelling the rain before it falls. He didn't know the fault lines running under the floor he was standing on, but I did. I had mapped them. I had repaired them. And I knew one day, when the pressure built high enough, those lines would open wide. And on that day, no speech, no smile, no promise would save him. Or them. Even after they replaced me, I still came in sometimes, on the days when something broke and no one else knew where to start. There was no contract now, no paycheck waiting at the end of the week, just a phone call, usually from someone lower down who still remembered the times I had saved the place from grinding to a halt. I would walk in quietly, toolbox in hand, not expecting thanks, not looking for conversation. But the building felt different now. The corridors, once alive with a hum I could read like a language, the whir of the servers, The muffled talk about project timelines, the shuffle of people leaning in over a problem, were heavy with another kind of sound. Absence. Conversations died when I turned the corner. Footsteps slowed, as if the people walking didn't want to be seen next to me for too long. I would catch fragments of whispers, half-finished sentences. My name dropped into them like something fragile and unwelcome, and always that question, sharp and casual at the same time. Why is he even here? It wasn't asked to me directly. It was asked to the air, to someone else in passing, but loud enough to make sure it reached my ears. The first time I pretended not to notice. The second time I told myself it didn't matter. But after a while, those words began to sink in like a slow leak, filling a part of me I didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't just dismissal anymore. It was erasure in progress, one whisper at a time. Still, I would do the work they called me in for. I'd step into the server room, close the door behind me, and lose myself in the familiar rhythm of wires and circuits. In there, away from their stares, the machines didn't care if my name was still on the payroll. They didn't ask if I belonged. They simply responded to my hands the way they always had, humming back to life under my touch. That was the only place I still felt like I had a purpose here. But stepping back into the hallway was always a reminder of the new order. I was no longer part of the current. I was an interruption. People passed me without eye contact, their smiles tight, their pace quick. I had become the ghost in the building, visible, but not to be engaged with for too long. They didn't understand that my presence wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about making sure the present didn't collapse entirely. I told myself I could endure it, that the whispers were just noise, but deep down, I knew they were building something, an unspoken consensus that my time had passed, that my usefulness had an expiration date, and it was printed in bold. The truth they didn't see was that every system they relied on still had my fingerprints buried somewhere inside it, and when the day came that one of those systems failed in a way their new star couldn't fix, they would remember exactly why I was here. They would remember too late. It began like so many others. Another board meeting I wasn't supposed to be part of, but was still asked to stand by, just in case. I stood near the wall, out of the circle of importance, a quiet figure they could forget until they needed a cable fetched or a connection checked. The room was bright with morning light spilling through the tall windows, the table crowded with laptops, cups of coffee, and the restless energy of people talking over each other. Screens flickered with charts and projections, voices overlapping as they debated the next big move. My role was to wait in the shadows, invisible until summoned. I had learned to tune out their voices, to listen instead to the subtler language of the building, the low thrum of the air system, the faint hum of electricity in the walls, the comforting pulse of the servers through the floor. It was a language I'd spoken for decades, one that told me when things were healthy and when something was off. That morning, it was steady, predictable, until it wasn't. Without warning, the hum vanished. The air in the vents fell silent. The lights overhead blinked once, then gave up entirely, plunging the room into a sudden swallowing darkness. The screens died mid-sentence, their glow replaced by the muffled sound of confusion. Voices catching, chairs scraping against the floor, someone knocking over a cup. In an instant, the confident rhythm of the meeting collapsed into panic. The silence that followed wasn't the calm kind. It was dense, pressing in on every side. Outside the boardroom, the halls seemed to exhale all at once. The distant machinery fading into nothing, the elevator freezing between floors, the entire building realizing it had lost its heartbeat. People shifted uneasily, the bravado from minutes earlier gone. Someone fumbled with a phone, swore under their breath. Another person called for the backup generator, their voice already fraying at the edges. I stayed where I was, letting my eyes adjust to the dim outline of faces. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't a small outage. This was a fault that ran deep, past the easy fixes, into the veins of the building itself. And I knew, even before they did, that the new face in my old chair wouldn't know where to start. The irony hung in the air like static. They had put me against the wall to keep me out of the way, to remind me that my time was over. But now, in the sudden blackout, the power wasn't the only thing missing from the room. Something else had gone dark, too. Their illusion that they could do without me. And somewhere in the pitch-black quiet, I felt it shift, the balance of need tilting back toward me. They just didn't know it yet. The darkness was total. Thick, almost physical, the kind that makes you forget which way the room is shaped. One moment, the space had been filled with the sterile glow of LED panels and the constant flicker of screens. The next, it was stripped bare, leaving only the jagged edges of voices breaking through the silence. The computers had gone down in perfect unison, their fans winding to a stop like a dying breath. Somewhere in the ceiling, the ventilation system exhaled one last warm gust and fell silent, leaving the air unnervingly still. At first, no one moved. It was as if the entire boardroom was holding its breath, waiting for the lights to snap back on, for the reassuring hum of machinery to return. But seconds stretched into long, unfamiliar minutes, and the quiet began to feel dangerous. Chairs scraped backward. A few people reached for their phones, only to realize the Wi-Fi was gone. Some instinctively tried to open laptops, forgetting the batteries were long neglected and as dead as the room around them. The confidence they wore like tailored suits began to slip. The air grew heavier with every passing moment, thickening into something close to panic. People's voices rose, competing to be heard, as if volume alone could push back the dark. The CEO's tone, usually measured and deliberate, had a sharp, brittle edge now. Someone demanded to know where the generator was. Someone else said it should have kicked in by now, and another voice whispered what no one wanted to hear, that if the ventilation didn't come back soon, the air quality would start to drop in a matter of hours. I stayed still in my place by the wall, letting my eyes adjust to the faint outlines. Faces pale and disoriented, papers scattered across the table like wreckage. I could hear their breathing now, faster than before, and the shuffling of feet as people moved without direction. This wasn't just the absence of light. It was the unraveling of control. And it was happening to the very people who had been so certain they could run this place without me. I didn't feel satisfaction, at least not yet. What I felt was the deep, almost physical recognition of a system in distress. I knew the building like I knew my own heartbeat, and right now, it was faltering badly. The new man in my old seat was hunched forward, murmuring something to the CFO, his hands hovering over a dead keyboard, as if sheer proximity might wake it. He didn't understand the scope of the failure. None of them did. I could feel it, though. The blackout wasn't a glitch, it was a cascade. Something critical had failed, and without intervention, the damage would spread into places they didn't even know existed. In the dark, the walls felt closer, the floor beneath us heavier. Time was moving even if the room felt frozen, and with each passing second the cost of their confidence was growing. They had told me I was no longer needed, but right now in this suffocating quiet, every one of them was about to find out just how wrong they had been. The darkness had been unsettling, but what came next was far more revealing. Chaos has its own sound. A tangled knot of voices pitched too high, the clatter of objects knocked over, the uneven rhythm of hurried footsteps. It started at one end of the room where someone's phone call broke into sharp fragments of desperation, a voice demanding answers from a maintenance team that wasn't picking up. Across the table, another person was stabbing at their tablet screen, muttering about the backup generator, insisting it had to be running by now. But there was no hum from the basement, no vibration in the floor to signal it had come online. The generator was as lifeless as everything else. Near the far wall, I watched two junior staff members huddle over a thick binder of emergency procedures, flipping page after page so fast they were only seeing the headings. Their eyes darted over diagrams and code sequences they didn't understand, their fingers tracing wires on paper as if the drawings might magically translate into action. But they weren't reading. They were searching for something that would tell them, in plain words, what to do. They wouldn't find it. The binder had been written for people who already understood the heartbeat of this building, and right now, that heartbeat was fading. The room had begun to fracture into small, frantic clusters. Some people barked orders, others argued about priorities, and a few stood motionless, as if frozen by the sudden weight of not knowing. The new man in my old chair had a phone pressed to his ear, his other hand waving in irritation at someone across the table. His tone was confident, but the words, half overheard, were empty scaffolding. He was asking for updates he couldn't interpret, suggesting fixes that didn't apply. Still, no one challenged him yet. That kind of truth only arrives when failure becomes undeniable. I stayed where I was, not out of hesitation, but because I knew what they didn't, that rushing in without a plan would only feed the chaos. Years of experience had taught me that in the first minutes of a crisis, the loudest voices often make the biggest mistakes. My instincts wanted to move, to put my hands on the systems I'd kept alive for so long, but I waited. I let them run in circles, watched them collide with their own lack of preparation. The air in the room was changing. Without ventilation, it was already warmer, heavier, the scent of coffee giving way to something sharper, nervous sweat, paper, and the metallic tang of tension. Shadows stretched strangely in the pale light bleeding from the windows, catching the edges of faces that looked younger now, smaller. Their authority didn't fill the space anymore. These were the same people who had once told me I was in the way, that the future needed a different kind of leadership. And yet here they were, in the first true test without me, reduced to shouting into deadlines and leafing through instructions like tourists in a city where they couldn't read the street signs. I could feel it building, the moment when the noise would collapse into silence, when every eye would start to turn in the same direction, toward the one person who actually knew how to bring the building back to life. And for all their pride, I knew that moment was coming fast. It cut through the noise like a dropped glass shattering on tile. Those 3 words, sharp and unsteady, "Get him here." I almost thought I'd imagined it, but the way the room shifted told me I hadn't. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the source. It was the voice of the very man who, barely a week ago, had looked me in the eye and told me the company was moving forward without me. Back then his tone had been smooth, rehearsed, dripping with the false assurance of someone convinced he was making the right call. Now it was different. Raw, thinned by panic, stripped of the armor that comes from believing you're in control. I didn't move right away. I let the weight of the moment settle over the room, watching how the words hung there, reshaping the air. A few people exchanged quick glances, the kind that carry a quiet admission. The person we pushed out is the only one who can save us. The new man in my old chair went still for the first time since the blackout began. His hand, still holding his phone, dropped to his lap. He didn't look at me. Not yet. The one who had spoken, my former boss, looked older now. The lines in his face deeper, his posture slightly bent. There was no trace of the certainty he'd worn like a badge in every meeting. His eyes flicked toward me, not in command, but in something close to surrender. It wasn't an order anymore, it was a plea. Around us, the chaos slowed. The binder of emergency procedures was closed, the useless phone calls abandoned. Even the arguments dimmed to a low murmur, as if the collective energy of the room had turned toward a single point. I could feel their attention pressing on me, cautious but heavy, like the way a drowning man might watch the surface of the water, desperate for air. I took my time, not out of spite, but because I understood that a moment like this wasn't just about fixing the power. It was about shifting the ground beneath their feet. Every second of hesitation was another reminder that they'd chosen to remove the one person who could walk into this kind of darkness without fear. I stepped forward slowly, the weight of my toolbox in my hand grounding me, the familiar ache in my shoulder almost comforting. No one stopped me as I crossed the room. No one told me to wait by the wall this time. Their silence was its own admission, and in it I heard more than any apology they could have given. They had built their future without me in it, and it had taken less than a single morning for that future to fall apart. The words that had once been my dismissal were gone now, replaced by the only thing they could think to say when the lights went out and the air turned heavy. Get him here. And just like that, the balance between us shifted. Not because I had asked for it, but because they finally understood they had no choice. The walk to the control room felt longer than it had ever been, though I knew every inch of that hallway. I'd traveled it more times than I could count, sometimes at a steady pace, sometimes at a sprint, depending on how close the building was to failing. Today, it was neither. Today I walked with measured steps, the weight of my toolbox pulling down on my arm, the echo of my shoes marking each moment they had to live with their decision. No one spoke as I passed. The same people who once avoided eye contact now moved aside without being asked, their faces tight, their movements clipped, as if proximity to me was both a necessity and an uncomfortable reminder. The door to the control room loomed ahead, a heavy steel frame with a keycard reader I hadn't touched in months. When I slid my card, the familiar beep and click greeted me like an old friend. Inside, the air was different. Thicker, warmer, tinged with the faint scent of overheated circuits. The low hum that usually filled the space was gone, replaced by a silence that made every movement feel loud. My fingers brushed over the main panel, the surface warm under my hand. I could feel where the strain had been building, the way you can feel a pulse under skin. It took no thought to find the right switches, no hesitation to key in the codes I'd long since committed to muscle memory. My hands moved with a precision born from years of habit, adjusting settings, overriding safeties, coaxing the system back from its locked-down state. This was work that demanded patience and accuracy. One wrong step, and the cascade of failures could double. But my breathing was steady, my heart unshaken. This was my world. And here, I was not obsolete. Behind me, I sensed them gathering just beyond the doorway. They didn't crowd in, they knew better than to get in the way, but I could feel their eyes on my back, their silence stretching between us. They didn't understand what each movement meant, how the combination of pressure, sequence, and timing mattered more than brute force. They didn't need to. They only needed to see the unspoken truth. I had not been replaced here. I could not be. The panel lights began to stir, faint at first, like embers catching in the dark. One by one, systems acknowledged my commands. Power rerouted, circuits re-engaged, airflow recalibrated. The building's heartbeat was faint, but it was returning. I kept my gaze fixed on the controls, my hands steady, my mind 3 steps ahead of each change. This was no rescue in a blaze of glory. This was surgery in the shadows, and I was the only one in the room who knew how to wield the scalpel. When the final code was entered, I let my fingers rest on the edge of the console for a moment, feeling the vibration of life returning to the systems I'd built and protected for so long. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of the machinery, steady, deliberate, unshaken. I didn't look back at them yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of the moment before I did, because when I turned, I wanted them to see in my eyes what my hands had already proven. I wasn't just back at the controls. I had never truly left. It happened in a rhythm I'd known for years, a sequence so familiar it was almost a song. One switch engaged, and somewhere deep in the building, a circuit caught hold. Click. The monitors began to glow, their cold blue light cutting through the shadows like a sunrise. Another adjustment, click, and the overhead lamps flared to life, banishing the heavy darkness that had settled over every corner of the boardroom. The first rush of air through the ventilation ducts followed seconds later, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of the system's awakening. It slid over my skin like the first breath after holding it for too long. And then came the sound I had been waiting for. The servers, rising from their silence with a low, steady roar, fans spinning back into motion, hard drives humming in unison. For them, it was relief. For me, it was vindication. Each note of that sound carried the truth they had tried to bury, that this place, for all its polished glass and new faces, still ran on the work I had done, the systems I had built, the knowledge I carried in my hands. Without it, without me, all their ideas and meetings meant nothing. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. The room seemed to exhale. People straightened in their chairs, voices softened, the tension that had gripped them melting into a cautious calm. No one celebrated, not openly. They knew better than to cheer for the very thing they had been so quick to discard. But I saw it in the way they glanced at me now. Longer, heavier, no longer trying to look past me as they once did. I kept my movements deliberate, finishing the last of the resets, checking the readings with the ease of someone who didn't have to second-guess a single decision. My breathing stayed even. I didn't need to speak. The building was speaking for me now, every light and every breath of cool air carrying the same message. I was still the one who could bring it back from the brink. The quiet between the machinery's hums felt different now. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence that follows a reckoning. They could dress it up later as unexpected technical issues or a minor systems outage, but every person in that room knew the truth. When the lights had gone out, so had their certainty that they could run this place without me. And when the lights came back on, it wasn't because of luck or protocol or the man in my old chair. It was because the person they had sent to the wall had stepped forward and reminded them what competence looks like when it's not trying to impress, only to work. For them, it was the sound of salvation. For me, it was the sound of the truth resurfacing, steady, undeniable, impossible to silence again. They didn't rush in all at once. It was more like a slow drift, as if gravity itself had changed and begun pulling them toward the place they'd been avoiding for months. The glow from the panels spilled into the hallway, cutting a narrow path of light across the floor, and they followed it like moths, unsure if they should get closer to the flame. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the console, the faint vibration of the revived systems humming up through my arm. They gathered in a half circle, leaving just enough space between us to make it clear they still didn't know how to stand beside me. Some looked at the panels, some at their shoes. A few tried to hold my gaze, but dropped it quickly, like children who've been caught in a lie and don't yet know if they'll be punished. Their faces were bare in the light now. No corporate polish, no meeting masks, just the raw, unedited truth of people who'd bet against the wrong outcome. No one clapped. No one said thank you. That would have been too direct, too much like admitting they'd been wrong. Gratitude, here, wasn't a currency they could afford without also paying the debt of acknowledgement. So they stood in a kind of suspended quiet, every second stretching into something heavier. I could feel it in the air, that subtle shift when people realize the story they've been telling themselves can't survive the evidence in front of them. The new man in my old chair kept to the edge of the group, his shoulders rounded in a way I'd never seen before. The confidence he wore in meetings, the easy grin, the forward lean, the habit of speaking just a little louder than anyone else, had collapsed. He didn't look at me. He didn't even look at the panels. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as though avoiding the scene might somehow keep him separate from the failure everyone could now smell in the air. I scanned the room slowly, letting my gaze pass over each face. Not to intimidate, not to gloat, but to make sure they understood this moment wasn't about the building coming back to life. It was about what it took to do it, and how that skill wasn't something you could replace with a handshake and a promise. They'd spent months pretending I was an outdated page in the manual, a piece of history they could file away, and in one morning, they'd learned the truth. I wasn't a chapter they could skip. I was the spine holding the whole thing together. The silence deepened. Somewhere in the distance, the steady whir of the ventilation returned, cool air whispering through the ducts, the servers settling into their familiar rhythm. It was the sound of the building breathing again, but underneath that hum was another sound, quieter but no less real, the sound of their certainty breaking. The shatter wasn't loud. It was the kind you feel, the kind that leaves pieces inside you long after you've swept the floor. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Words would have been a kindness, and I wasn't here to give them comfort. I wanted the weight of this moment to stay with them, to follow them back into that boardroom, to sit at the table next to their coffee cups and remind them, every time they looked toward the control room, that without me, all of this could fall dark again. And if it did, they might not get another chance to stand in this half circle, watching me bring it back. They waited a day before making the offer. I knew it would come, not because they wanted me back, but because they needed to convince themselves they could still fix what had been exposed. The email was short, too careful in its wording, avoiding any mention of the blackout, or the fact that, without me, they had been a breath away from losing everything. Instead, it spoke of restructuring, of strategic reintegration, as if the past months had been nothing more than an experiment that could now be quietly adjusted. They dressed it in the language of opportunity, but underneath it was a simple plea. Come back. Sit in the chair we took from you. Pretend none of this happened. I read it twice, not to understand the words, they were transparent, but to feel the shift it represented. This was not the voice of people in control. It was the voice of people who had seen the edges of their safety and realized they didn't know how to hold it together without me. For a moment I imagined walking back in, reclaiming my desk, feeling the familiar weight of the work settle in my hands. But the thought passed quickly, because I knew exactly how it would go, gratitude fading to routine, routine fading to forgetfulness, until the cycle began again. I had been here before, and the truth was simple. A seat offered out of desperation is not a seat worth taking. So I said no. Not in anger, not with triumph, but with the kind of clarity that comes from finally seeing the shape of the game you've been playing. My place now wasn't in a room where I had to wait for disaster to be recognized. My place was where my value didn't need proof in the form of a crisis, where the knowledge I carried wasn't an afterthought, but the reason the light stayed on in the first place. Word of my refusal spread faster than I expected. Some people tried to mask their surprise, telling themselves I had other plans, that perhaps I was moving on to new challenges. But I knew that for a few the refusal would echo louder, a quiet reminder that there are some bridges you can't rebuild just by asking. I began to picture my work in a different setting, one where my presence wasn't tolerated in the shadows, but invited into the light, where I could still listen for the hum of machinery, still feel the satisfaction of coaxing life back into metal and wire, but without the weight of those who saw me as expendable until proven otherwise. I thought of rooms where my voice would not need to rise above whispers to be heard, where I would not be an afterthought leaning against a wall, waiting for things to fail before being seen. The old chair would remain in their office, polished and ready for someone else to occupy. They could keep it. Let them fill it with another smile, another promise. Let them trust it will be enough. I no longer wanted the seat they'd once pushed me out of, because I'd learned something in the dark, that my worth wasn't tied to their table, their titles, or their approval. And once you've learned that, you don't go back. You build your own place, and you choose who gets a seat. I walked the corridor slowly, letting my steps echo against the concrete floor one last time. The air here was cooler than in the offices above, carrying that faint metallic scent of circuitry and dust that had settled into my bones over the years. This was the heart of the building, the place where the real work lived, hidden from the boardroom windows and the polished smiles. I had spent more of my life here than anywhere else, often in hours when the city slept, the lights dimmed to a low hum, and the only sound was the steady breath of the machines. As I passed the first row of servers, my hand reached out almost without thinking, fingertips grazing the smooth, warm panels. The vibration beneath the surface was subtle but alive, a pulse I could read like an old friend's heartbeat. I'd felt these same machines through moments of strain and relief, through the panic of an unexpected failure and the quiet satisfaction of bringing them back from the edge. They had never questioned me, never whispered behind my back, never asked for proof of my worth. They simply responded to my touch, trusted my hands to keep them alive. I paused at one unit near the center of the room, the oldest still in operation. I remembered the night a storm had nearly drowned it, water seeping into the basement faster than the pumps could manage. I'd waded through ankle-deep water to reach it, balancing on the edge of panic and precision as I rerouted power and sealed connections. That night, I'd left soaked to the skin, but with the machine still humming, oblivious to how close it had come to silence. Looking at it now, I felt that same quiet pride, unseen by most but deeply real. Every screw, every blinking light in this room had its story. I knew them all. The faint hum in the far left rack that told me it was under heavier load than the others. The almost imperceptible flicker of a panel that meant the backup drive was cycling. The smell of a power supply running a few degrees hotter than it should. These were my markers, the unspoken language between me and the work. And as I walked past each row, it felt less like a job I was leaving, and more like a set of friendships I was saying goodbye to. I traced one last line along the edge of a panel, my reflection faint in its black gloss. The machines didn't care that I wouldn't be back. They didn't know about politics or titles. They only knew that for all these years, when they faltered, I was there, and I had never once walked away while they were still in need. When I reached the far end of the room, I turned back for a final look. The servers blinked steadily in the dim light, rows of quiet sentinels, each one a reminder of what I had built and protected. I knew that in time they would fail. Everything does. And maybe someone else would be here to bring them back. But they would never know these machines the way I did. They wouldn't feel the history in every hum, the trust in every light that flickered back to life under my hands. I left without ceremony, without looking for anyone to watch me go. My goodbye wasn't for them. It was for this room, for the work, for the certainty that when it counted, I had never let it down, and that truth would outlast any plaque or thank you they might have given. It would live here, in the heartbeat of the machines, long after my footsteps faded from the floor. When I stepped out of the server room for the last time, the first thing that met me wasn't the sight of anyone waiting. It was the sound, that deep, steady hum of the restored system, rising and falling in perfect rhythm, threading itself through the hallways. It wrapped around me like a final handshake, one I trusted far more than anything human hands had offered in months. It was the heartbeat of the building, alive again because I had willed it so, and it followed me as I walked, filling the silence they had left in their absence. No one clapped, no one called after me. The corridors were empty. The offices I passed closed off in glass and quiet. They didn't need to be there. In fact, their absence made the moment cleaner. This wasn't a scene for their approval. It was my own private reckoning, and the applause I heard was in the machinery, the soft rush of air in the vents, the faint vibration in the walls, the whisper of power flowing where it should. I didn't rush. My steps were deliberate, each one pulling me farther from the room where they had once kept me against the wall, waiting to be useful. The light overhead was brighter now, steady and unflinching, nothing like the flicker of those early minutes in the dark. I thought about how easily they had almost lost it, how quickly their confidence had drained when the hum went silent. And I thought about how, in the end, they would never say out loud what they had realized, that my worth wasn't something they could measure in titles or replace with a fresh face. The quiet around me wasn't empty. It was layered with memory, of nights when I'd been the only one here, coaxing life back into stubborn systems, listening to the same hum that filled the building now. Back then, I had done it because it mattered, because there was pride in making sure things worked when no one else knew how. Today, I was leaving with the same pride intact, untouched by their dismissal, because the work had spoken louder than any defense I could have made for myself. By the time I reached the main doors, the sound of the building's heartbeat was softer, but still there, like a reminder that my touch would linger in its walls long after I was gone. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. My answer had already been given, not in words, not in confrontation, but in the simple fact that they had needed me and I had delivered. The quiet I carried with me into the street was heavier than any applause could have been. It was the quiet of a truth they couldn't ignore, the kind that doesn't fade with time, and that was enough. A month passed before I set foot anywhere near the building again. I hadn't planned to return, but my path through the city took me close enough that curiosity slowed my steps. The windows looked the same from the outside, reflective, unbothered, hiding everything inside as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Buildings hold memories, even if people pretend they don't. I told myself I wouldn't go in. I told myself it wasn't my place anymore. And yet my feet carried me toward the side entrance, the one I used to take when I came in before sunrise, long before the board members even thought of arriving. The door opened with the same slight resistance it always had, as if the hinges had never been oiled quite enough. The air inside was familiar, cool, tinged with the faint metallic scent of machines at work. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it until that first breath. The corridors were quiet, but not in the way they had been the day I left. This was the soft, steady quiet of a place running as it should. I moved almost without thinking toward the server room, that long, narrow space that had been both my workshop and my refuge for so many years. And when I reached the door, I saw it. It was small, barely larger than my hand, and mounted neatly to the wall just beside the entry. A brushed steel plate, the kind that catches light without glare, engraved in simple, precise lettering. In memory of the one who turned the lights back on when everything else went dark, I stood there longer than I expected, reading it over and over. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't wanted any plaque or public gesture, but someone, maybe one of the junior staff, maybe an old colleague, had understood that the worth of a person isn't measured in titles, in salaries, in how many times their name appears in a meeting agenda. It's measured in the moments when everything is failing, when panic is spreading, and you are the one who steps forward without hesitation, who restores the heartbeat of a place when no one else can. The words were quiet. They didn't shout my name to the world, but they didn't have to. They were enough to anchor me to this place in a way no office or title ever could. My work lived on here, not just in the circuits and cables I'd mended, but in the understanding, however silent, that sometimes the truest value shines brightest when you've been pushed into the dark. I reached out and let my fingers rest against the plate. The metal was cool, smooth and solid beneath my touch. I thought about the years I'd spent in this building, the crises I'd navigated, the moments no one remembered except me and these machines, and I realized that this quiet acknowledgement born without ceremony, was all I needed. I didn't stay long. Just a moment to breathe in the familiar hum, to let the recognition settle in my chest, and to leave knowing that somewhere in these walls there was a small piece of truth that no meeting, no decision, no replacement could erase. When I stepped back into the daylight, I carried that truth with me, not as a weight, but as a light that doesn't fade no matter how far you walk from where it began.